Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This is our monthly AITC seminar webinar from Johns Hopkins Artificial Intelligence Technology Collaboratory. My name is Phan. I'm the Alonzo Virginia Decker Professor at Johns Hopkins. I have appointments in the Business School and the Department of Medicine, and I direct the Networking and Mentoring Forum. Now, I have a great pleasure this afternoon to introduce to you Dr. Suchi Saria. Dr. Saria is John C. Malone Associate Professor at the Johns Hopkins Whiting School of Engineering and at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. She directs the Machine Learning and Healthcare Lab and is the founding research director of the Malone Center for Engineering and Healthcare. Now, Dr. Saria is founder as well of Bayesian Health, which develops adaptive AI technologies that sit within EMRs, essentially to function as a co-pilot for clinicians to help provide early warning signals when patient status changes. So that's actually what we're going to be talking about today. Today, we're going to have a chat with Dr. Saria about her career, as a researcher, but I think more importantly, in the interest of many who are attending today, her not transition, but the extension of her work into the commercial space, her experience in founding Bayesian Health, some of the challenges, some of the lessons that she learned. If she did do it all over again, what would she do different, if anything else, if she's going to do different. I know that you'll have questions for her. And so if you can put your questions into chat after our initial chat, she and I will have a conversation. After that, I'll field the questions to her and, we'll see where that goes. This webinar is designed for an hour, and we will keep to that time, understanding that you may have lunch to go back to. So without further ado, Dr. Saria, can you tell us briefly how you came to do AI research, sort of something about your research career, and then maybe in the midst of that, where do you see some emerging challenges for AI researchers are coming from and should be aware of?
Yeah, so I got interested in AI a long time ago when I was quite young, a little over 20 years ago, got into the field more formally in AI research, started working on mostly the core algorithmic side, and from an application perspective, looking at robotics, and in particular thinking about how do we design algorithms that learn from the real world in terms of sensory data that we're acquiring, and trying to make sense of fundamental robotics tasks like navigation, planning, vision. And interestingly, it also sort of overlapped with around that time when the idea of learning from data using statistical methods was sort of just starting, this brand new, this everything you see now, Gen AI and deep learning and all of that has been sort of the expansion of more and more math and stats and optimization with engineering implemented on larger and larger and more complex real world data, and how do we learn as opposed to pre-programmed systems based on expert knowledge. And interestingly, at the time, there was still sort of this question of how can we really, how powerful can these learning systems be? How do we generalize them to learn from in more and more complex scenarios with more complex data, which maybe are not as well tended to, and learning from interaction in the real world. So that's where most of my core early research directions in AI were. And then at some point while I was at Stanford, around 2008, got interested. So a lot of my work was time series data focused, and got interested in electronic health records. This was sort of very early pre-High-Tech Act. Health systems were just starting to implement EMRs or go into Epic or Cerner or many of these common EMR systems you see. Prior to that, maybe if they had an EMR, it was very slim, trim, and maybe a basic electronic system. And as part of that, got roped into a pretty amazing, a moonshot style project that was funded to say, what does designing machine learning like as these new kinds of data come to be, you know, in a way in medicine, these data haven't existed before. Couldn't we like understand patients very differently? Response, progression, adverse events, like there's so many parts of care delivery value change if we can leverage this data well and correctly. But the problem was our AI was never built with these data sets in mind. It was built with Facebook images or, you know, other kind of more low stakes applications, if you will. And so my interest in medicine kind of grew just around that time, like starting to understand both that these new data sets were going to come to life, what the challenges were going to be, how, you know, there was going to be really need for people to think fundamentally and foundationally differently than we've thought about building AI before, and started working on methods with these data sets in mind. Fast forward, came to Hopkins, and a lot of my reason for moving here was really to marry deep understanding of the technology with deep understanding of medicine. And what I mean by that is really going all the way from, you know, like the end to end, which is what's required to bring any fundamental technology to market, right? Reimbursement, regulatory, like how does it fit into the care delivery model? Like how does it change workflow? Who's using it? Who are your stakeholders? What are the incentives of these stakeholders? You know, and so really you need deep familiarity, not just with the technology, but the full ecosystem to bring some kind of technology to life. And my focus at Hopkins was very much expanded from not just thinking about the tech itself, but thinking about the practical barriers that we needed to close. Like how do we draw inferences that are reliable and trustworthy that clinicians will trust? You know, like clinicians will use it. To how do you deliver it in a way that addresses kind of the workflow challenges they face with current systems in mind, so that it makes their job easier, not harder? How do you account for the returns from a clinical finance? There's clinical return, but there's financial return, and who pays for it? How do you introduce this in a risk-averse regulatory framework so that there's a way to think about? And so my work has touched all of the above in one or more capacities. In the last 3 years, I've been working with the FDA directly in funded research around AI safety, and Bayesian in particular brings all of this to life in a very practical fashion. It's basically bringing state-of-the-art AI technology at the point of care in a fashion that is like fully, you know, compliant and conversant with, you know, things we need to care about: security, privacy, regulatory, reimbursement, and like deployed in a way that we can help health systems adopt it, right? It's not just a futuristic technology that you're giving a research talk on, but a very practical solution that solves problems today.
So wow. So this is very interesting because, you know, you started by saying you were interested in developing algorithms, and then now it's much less about the algorithms, isn't it? It's almost thinking about, if you are a user of the algorithms, how can they actually be useful within the ecosystem, which has very little to do with the algorithms. It has to do with, you know, the way it's used and how it's paid for, et cetera, all that. How did you, I mean, okay, you know, you're an engineer, right? All the engineers I know really get excited about the technology. So how did you sort of come to realize or make that transition from the technology increasingly to the commercial side, which I do agree with you is really where the rubber hits the road, right? I mean, the technology is not very useful if people are not going to actually use it, and the utilization involves so many of these things that it's not about the technology.
Yeah, so I think I completely agree with you. So I think some of it maybe had to do with my upbringing. So in my younger grad school days, I was part of another spin out that was spun out of Stanford. It was not in healthcare, it was in the core data infrastructure space called Aster Data. And it was basically spinning out deep research-led, you know, at the time, most data used to sit on monolithic supercomputers. And the idea of, so you could fit the data set in a single machine. It was a very big machine, it was an expensive machine, but you could fit it in. And then what happened in the 2000s with the advent of the internet was that now every company had access, you know, petabytes or zettabytes of data, depending on the size, like a social media company or a, you know, any online company collects data on its users and what they're doing and where they're going. And they want to use that data to make improve user experience and make, you know, deliver products in a more effective fashion. understand the business. And so with Aster, what was really interesting was, so I was their number 4 person in the company, very early days, got to talk to what are now giant companies, but at then were very little. And they were sort of grappling with this idea of like, we have all this data, we don't know what machine learning or AI to do with it. We think you should be doing something like clustering or whatever. And the words that are household names back then were very not poorly understood, right? Because there weren't that many companies that did AI ML in the real world. And at Aster, we were building distributed Postgres, so distributed data analytic warehouse technology that we could implement at a site and help them bring their data to use and employ distributed ML to basically bring their data use for a variety of problems. That experience for me was, it was during my PhD. I took time off a little bit to do that, but was really formative. It was like phenomenal to see that sort of what I was studying and then how it comes to life in the real world and what the gaps are. I guess that combined with, my, I think some of my mentors have all been people who were phenomenal researchers, but also phenomenal at scaling ideas in the real world. Like one of my mentors was Daphne Kohler, and, she founded Coursera, which is a company all of us know. Andrew Ng, Sebastian Thrun, he spun out a company that became the Google autonomous car. Google bought it. And then, between the 3 of them, there were multiple game-changing technologies that were brought to life. And several of my peer researchers that I look to are people like that, where it's not just about thinking in a narrow way, but it's really about, like, if you're going to make a sea change in an area, it's very useful to think backwards from, like, what is the change going to require? And to me, what was really fulfilling is that in bringing the sea change, it's not just about learning the practicalities, is that the practicalities then inform your research. Like, the algorithmic work we've done has been dramatically more impactful because the kinds of algorithms we're designing now are very different from the kinds of algorithms I would have designed when I had no experience of the real world, right? Like, we did 5 years of like really incredible work on the AI safety front and AI robustness, and work that is now cited by, FDA's regulatory guidelines that they've. But all of that came from us trying to move AI in the real world, seeing where it breaks, realizing there are all these challenges around drifts and shifts and monitoring that we need to address, or the way AI needs to be transparent, not just interpretable or explainable, which is what people think, which is not what our users care about. They want it to be transparent and easy to collaborate with. And how do you build AI in that way, right? So it's kind of the equivalent of, imagine you're designing a drug, but you're sitting in a lab. You've never put it to any mouse or a human or any molecule. You don't know if it's going to work. Like, you've built a concoction, but it's only when it hits the real world, you start to see where it breaks, what fails, what doesn't work. And I think in that sense, computer science and AI has been a fascinating field like that. It's theory deeply married to practice, right? Like, a lot of our biggest AI inventions have all been, search, translation, autonomous driving, or driving in any way, supervised, semi-supervised driving, have all been examples of scenarios where the best research came out of marrying real world knowledge with like theory.
So that's very interesting. Basically, the sort of trial and error, if you will, that occurs in real life becomes the basis for the advancement of the technology itself, right? As opposed to the technology being sort of applied to problems and then, gets refined. That's interesting. But here's the thing. You grew up with this. I mean, you were working with these people that we sort of now take for granted. If you're a researcher today, how do you get those kinds of insights? Like, you grew up with it. So in your mind, it's maybe obvious. But if you're a new researcher, a graduate student, your graduate students, what do you tell them in terms of how to make what they do actually useful? Because I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah. So one thing I often think about when I'm talking to my graduate students is, I want you to think big, and I want you to actually understand the problem. Like, a lot of times I feel like in research, we're, It makes total sense because research is such a high pressured environment, and you're basically just trying to publish a paper. And you're trying to figure out what is the least publishable unit, right? So you're basically like not married to the problem, you're married to the idea of publishing a paper. And so what ends up happening is you're just trying to figure out some idea on which you can write something and publish it. So you can say you've published some collection of papers and you have something to point to. But I think with my students, one thing I'll often do is find big open areas where there's lots of opportunity for new work, and encourage them to think not just as a paper, but what's the big idea? Like, what are the big holes that need to be filled? Where are the challenges today? And then how do we work our way there? And then give them exposure to real world, like, some of the students I graduated recently, one of them now, wrote a gorgeous piece of work from all the way from papers that went all the way from core theory, but to practice to policy, and now he's full-time at the FDA as an example, doing more of the work on AI ML safety. So that will be super exciting to see where he takes it. But at first when he joined, he was very uncomfortable because he understood the rubric of I have an algorithmic idea and I can make an innovation on top of it, and choosing to write pretty narrow papers, if you will, and thinking broad, we got invited to write a New England Journal of Medicine perspective on this area of give us the big broad problem where the challenge is and how do we go about thinking about it holistically. Something like that would make him very uncomfortable because it's too open, it's too broad, and it's too unclear. What are we trying to do? But as we made headway together in articles like that and pieces like that, he started to see the big picture of how it all comes together. And then in our work with the FDA, he started to see how the regulatory agencies think today versus how they should be thinking, and where the gaps are, which naturally then motivates him to start seeing how he could play a role in closing those gaps. So I think in a nutshell, giving them as broad exposure as possible, encouraging them to think area rather than a narrow paper, and encouraging them to understand the problem, qualitatively, not just in a narrow niche, but what's the big implication here? What is the bigger thing you're trying to do? Why is this useful? And, slowly building up the knowledge of the space, as well as meeting experts, through meeting people, not just within the field, but outside the field. Does that help?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a great challenge. I mean, I think all graduate programs sort of challenge, right? I mean, of course, as we know, the constraint always is the students need to get a job and then they need to, get tenure promoted and all that. But I agree. I think that, if all of us collectively push against sort of this narrow view, change will happen. So you mentioned patient health. I do want to talk about that because at some point you decide, okay, I want to go do something with this, right? And this is actually, it sounds to me already after you've come to the realization that it's not just about the technology. I mean, there's a whole ecosystem that it has to be embedded in. So maybe you can talk a little bit about, how you come to found patient health and what were some of the big insights in your initial journey? Because I think a lot of the participants here are sort of, facing that challenge. Yeah.
Yeah. So to me, I feel like I've been on a 10-year quest to figure out there's all this data we're collecting in the real world care delivery environment, but this use of this data to influence and drive decision making to improve efficiency and efficacy for care delivery is still very much a nascent field. And a lot of my work has focused on how do we build solutions that bring this data together, compute them in real time, make them AI computable in real time, so that you can now, and also AI computable in a way that is valid, trustworthy, and usable and actionable, and make it then visible within workflow in a way that you can, caregivers can use it to do things differently and to impact outcomes. One area where I've done a huge amount of work is this area of sepsis. It's the leading cause of hospital deaths. I actually got introduced to this area back in 2012 from colleagues of mine at Hopkins, and specifically Peter Pronovost. He sort of brought up this area among many harms where there's, today we don't really have great ways to think about it. And the more I read, the more it sort of blew me away that like our current approach to monitoring patient safety and harms is literally creating yet another checklist and telling our nurses to do more work. It's like a common thing I'll hear in the field is we've given our nurses 30 hours of work to do in a 12-hour shift or an 8-hour shift. It's like it's made their lives impossible. And no wonder it's leading to burnout. No wonder it's leading to a lot of them leaving the workforce. And we're like struggling as a national crisis of like staffing shortages and clinician burnout. And so I think in sepsis as an example area, and now there are a whole host of areas like this where if you can figure out a way we do have good treatments. The problem is we often don't catch this patient timely or like early enough in a timely fashion. And so the first part of my work was all around, can we even use I could start developing all sorts of new biomolecules to start measuring new things in the blood. But I already measure 1 million things as part of our care delivery setting. What if I were to use this data? Could I actually do detection in a way that is good enough? And turns out you can actually show really good results on early detection. And then you run into the practical hurdles of like, well, you can show pretty good detection in maybe a cohort that you've cleansed and curated in the lab in like a very particular way. But like now when you go from here to the real world setting, there's a lot of mess in the way people record things in the EMR, and there's variability as you go one from site to another. And if they're in the ED versus the floor, the ICU, there's different amounts of data. So then you go from like the this is possible in theory to is it possible in practice, which is like, can we design algorithms to be robust enough to do this kind of practical recognition in these very diverse, challenging settings? And in doing so, you have to, think through all of how do we make this technology robust? And from there and our lab wasn't just working in sepsis, but a host of other conditions. We started to see the same repeatable framework that like, one, you can, but two, the infrastructure required to deliver this is complicated. Basically how do you embed these real-time AI tools within the EMR? It's super non-obvious. One simple way in which EMRs attempted to do this is they said, well, we convert it into some simple logic, and then we just program it, and then you can just use the data real time. And they attempted to do something like this, and turns out there are lots of shortcomings of attempting it that way. And like Epic and Cerner and all of the EMR companies have implemented simple algorithms like that. But then, as this big area became of growing importance, people started seeing, well, do those approaches work? What people are doing within the EMR, does that actually work? Turns out it doesn't, right? It has crazy amounts of false alerting. It doesn't have accurate detection. But if you can actually kind of build the right infrastructure, there's hope. So we spun out Bayesian partly because from having first-hand experience, realizing how hard it is, to knowing what it would take to deliver and feeling like we had the know-how and the ability to actually deliver at scale, felt very compelling to me. I also lost my nephew to sepsis. So in part, it wasn't just a business problem or a technical problem. It was also a personal problem, like realizing to me that it's just wild, right? To be a scientist, you're working in a space and you realize like, oh my God, people come to you for expertise in the space, and in a way it's theoretical because you're telling them what you think as a scientist. And then when it becomes all when something like that happens, you start to think, okay, this isn't what am I going to do actually to help beyond sort of writing about ideas and talking about ideas? It's sort of all the extra motivation to go from theory to practice, and what it takes to really, really close the gap in a way that it really has to work, right? It can't just be like funfetti ideas anymore. Then it's like, well, is this real? And is it actually going to work? And are you bullshitting? Or is this, what are you going to do to close every gap? And to me, that's been a huge, founding Bayesian's been just like the most intense, energizing experience, partly because of how fast the field's been moving, how exciting it has been to see what the practical implementations are, how widely, how broadly applicable the ideas are, but also it's like energizing to feel as an inventor and a scientist that you can actually make a difference.
Yeah, I resonate a little bit with that. Actually, the technology you're working on is useful because it serves as a co-pilot, right? And as a co-pilot, it has to be sort of embedded in the workflow. So, we see a lot of attempts at sort of improving the EMR using these things. How did you manage to get either the hospital systems or Epic to accept this? Because my understanding is that hospitals and frankly, Epic and Cerner are fairly protective, right, about the environment. Sometimes for good reasons, sometimes, I'm not so sure. But so how did you get in? I think, because I think a lot of startups in this space run into that problem. Like, okay, where's the door? How do I get in to become part of that system?
Yeah, I actually agree. And this is a very significant challenge. So I think I had a lot of unfair advantages that many people don't have. So, like I recommend every startup founder to think hard about what is their unfair advantage and how do they bring their unfair advantage to their, I think like basically when you're trying to do something that is extremely hard and outsized that only a small, like startups are about high growth environments, right? And it's like outsized bets. So to make an outside bet, you have to figure out what's your edge. Like, why do what's your right to play? And that's more broadly, I think, a thing that, everyone who's thinking about ever taking the research, converting it into a company, you should think about that. Like, where is your edge and how do you leverage that edge? Our outsized advantage was, I had built infrastructure company. I had been part of an infrastructure company built before. So for us, this wasn't like the first time. Two, I had worked in nearly every service line as an AI researcher, so I understood what real pain points are from a frontline perspective and where there are real challenges, and could confidently talk to our stakeholders in a way that we could build trust, right? Like I wasn't coming to go and experiment on them. A lot of entrepreneurs, when you're trying to do something, you're coming from the outside and you're trying to implement something new, but you need an innovation ecosystem environment where you can be given access to explore and experiment. And that's a very difficult proposition for the health system because there's all this private data. It's a difficult proposition because you could take down the EMR. There's just so many things that can go wrong. So I think the outsized advantage of like being in an environment like Hopkins, where we had very deep exposure to what state of the art looked like, where the gaps were and what we were doing to close it, meant we understood deeply where the problems are and also what it would take to close those solutions. We understood like what are the security challenges, what are the privacy challenges, how do you design infrastructure that is state of the art from a privacy standpoint. So it was like a lot of hills to climb. Like I don't think starting a company like this in a space like this is like super easy. I think if I didn't have, it was a combination of like all the weight of Hopkins combined with sort of my very like, the huge network of people I have who understood infrastructure and like enterprise software and security and privacy. And then also like, we spent 2 years like we were a lab that Epic leadership knew really well and had looked to as a place for advice. Our papers were read by many of them. And so as a result, they were willing to partner with us in a different way than they would have with other groups. And then, of course, our investors were very helpful. We went outside and we got some of the best investors in the country to come support it. And what that meant was they have a massive network of people they know. And so ultimately it comes down to like an edge and the people and talent game, right? Like who do you know and what edge do they have and how do you bring these collective edges together to build it? I have to say in retrospect, Bayesian is a very exciting company, but it's a very hard company to start. I probably, if I had to do it all over again, I probably would take a more manageable, but sometimes they say like all things take a long time to build. You might as well work on the hard thing. Why work on the easy thing? But I don't know. So that's sort of one piece of advice, like think harder about kind of the lift. I, probably sort of was so motivated by the area itself, didn't really care to understand like how hard it was going to be. The last thing I want to say is though, one of the other things that I felt in building this company was it would be really helpful to me. It would have been really helpful to me. Like I cared about the solution, see the light of day. That was the most important thing to me. But at the time, and even now, there wasn't any other infrastructure I could rely on. So we had to build a lot of it from ground up. But now, one of the things I'm trying to do is enable other researchers. So if they have solutions that are like point solutions in like, say, particular clinical areas, right? Like, say delirium or, particular like clinical condition area where they've spent a huge amount of their life researching that space and they have very practical and, knowledge of that space and they want to bring it to life. But that's like one unit of work and they don't want to do the other 59 units of work to bring it to life. Now Bayesian can become a platform where we are now, partnering with other researchers and other practical, like, other groups where they may have solutions. And it's possible for us to go from there. Like it's kind of like drug discovery. You have a molecule in the lab and it's very promising. And how do you go from the molecule in the lab to scaled? And that's something in the last year we're starting to do.
So this is really important what you said, and if I were to restate that, for the audience, I think what Dr. Saria is saying, in this space particularly, because of the combination of, the peculiarities of the healthcare system and the technology, that you can't dabble, right? I mean, it's not like creating a little Etsy shop. You can't dabble. You got to have something to bring to the table, whether it's clinical experience, whether it's deep knowledge about some aspect of the care delivery system or a condition or something like that. And then presumably there is infrastructure now, given the years that has gone past, that can support the translation of the idea, to a real world solution. So I think that's really important. I think, entrepreneurs should think very hard about whether they want to go into a space. And I think with that, there are a couple of questions that I would like to pose to you that came from the audience, which is sort of related to that. Number one is, if you are someone who doesn't have a technical or academic background, right, how can you be involved in creating AI for good? So that's a very broad question. Presumably, AI is, I would say, increasingly ubiquitous to the point that many people feel like they can't just be sort of participants, right? Those who don't want to just be participants, they want to have some influence. How does one go about doing that?
Yeah, I strongly encourage, the cool thing again now compared to 10 years ago is there's so many companies who are working in AI, who are interested in AI and approaching it, either as AI first companies, so they have like really AI-led solutions, versus AI-enabled companies. They're using AI within, whatever business operations or whatever solution or area that they're offering. That there's really like literally a choice of 1,000 companies you could look at and try to decide like, what are you interested in? And then what do you bring to the table? Where's your outsized advantage? And how can you join a group? I highly recommend learning with people and learning from people. Like a lot of my own work came from just being lucky to be surrounded by incredibly talented people. I got a front row seat into both where the field was, where the gaps were, and what needed to happen. And so then I developed my own knowledge, and that gave me the confidence to keep pushing the frontier. So I think if you're really starting in the field, I often think the best way to start is to find some really good groups that are well established and have enough scaffolding that you can be a part of it, contributing to their process. And then from there, it'll be like really easy and natural to start identifying where the next set of opportunities are.
Okay, that's helpful. So I'm not going to take all the questions in order. I'm going to try to organize them in some fashion. The next question is a little bit more technical, and it has to do with the following. So John Coffey asks, how can we best combine real patient-generated digital health data from wearables to develop algorithms and research biomarkers of disease? And I think the etiology of the question is that a lot of the data is siloed, right? It's siloed across devices, it's siloed across institutions. How do you solve that problem if you're trying to build something that could actually be generalized, that is useful?
So the question was, a lot of the data is siloed. How do we make it useful by bringing them together?
Especially data from different sources, wearables, EMRs, so there's just huge data pools. It's not even a data lake or a data ocean, like a bunch of data pools, right? So if you're trying to build something and make it useful, how do you solve that problem? Is it even solvable?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think like what's been really, really exciting to watch in the last 3 to 5 years, I think especially three, I'd say, where different groups are coming forward. And when I say groups, I mean companies are coming forward and building infrastructure that pulls together different subsets of these data into a place that didn't exist before, and are building infrastructure to put it to use in particular applications. So an example would be there are companies that are looking to build infrastructure for monitoring patients at home so that you can start to collect that kind of data and maybe put that in a clinical trial type environment. This area is very, very early, but this is an example. And there are others that are looking to collect data from claims and like publicly available social media data and those kinds of data to better understand adverse events for pharmacovigilance. There are companies like Bayesian trying to bring together more of the clinical and SDOH type data sets and data around care and understanding whole person care to be able to provide longitudinal view into who this patient is, what their need is, and then do the right thing. And some of this is very much infrastructure challenge that we have to solve. Like, how do we bring these kinds of data together? Like, there are huge infrastructure challenges, right? Because as soon as you go from not just like a one-off, but something that works at scale, then you have to get it to work in diverse environments. You have to get it to work reliably across, right? So it's like a huge, like, it's a fundamental technology problem. Like, how do you stitch it? It's a governance problem too. What's your ability? Like, how do you put a framework in place so that the data is being used in a trustworthy way? Like there's governance around how the data is being used. What is it okay to be used for, and so on and so forth. But now I actually think that it's pretty exciting. We're seeing there's also like regulatory, like federal innovations that are happening, like ONC's no information blocking rule that happened last year, which prevents electronic health record companies from preventing access to certain data sets or to data. And that means suddenly these data, there are types of data that have to be visible. And now that the data is visible, naturally you can do also, there are third-party companies that are using the data to now do lots of useful things, like build better provider directories, give patients the ability to collect, for patients with multiple chronic comorbidities or complications, being able to pull together their own data to better understand their own health, right? Today, they feel like a little bit powerless, right? You go to a system, you do tests, you leave your data here, you go somewhere else, you leave your data there, you have no holistic view of who you are. How do you pull it all together in one place so that you can make sense of it, but also any clinician who touches you can make sense of it? And those are like really exciting, much needed application areas that now are coming to life.
So there are two questions related to working with the FDA, right? So the company's trying to put something out there using an AI-based, medical product or a device. How does one engage the FDA to begin this process? Because it's not obvious with AI. If it's a drug, there's a very clear pathway. If it's a device, there's a very clear pathway. With AI, what do you do?
So first of all, there are upwards of 600 medical devices that use AI that have been approved by the FDA in the last, so the point is there's a lot of precedence. And they have, just like you would get anything else approved, they have like a system by which you can, submit, depending on if it's a new device, in which case you would, a new use, like everything starts with the intended use. What problem are you trying to solve for whom? And can you precisely define the intended population, the use of your tool? And then as you define that, then you start to see, is this something that's been done before? In which case you can leverage what's called the 510K pathway, means you can show how you're similar to an existing device and get cleared in a much more expedited path. There are other scenarios where maybe the problem you're solving has never been solved before, it's completely new, in which case you would go down what's called the de novo regulatory path. And then it's a bit more involved. And but in almost both cases, there's sort of a notion of what is your intended use, what is the population, you design clinical studies to prove that the thing you're doing works the way you expect it to work, you define the risks, you define approaches to mitigating the risks. And really, so that's sort of the high-level conceptual framework. And then the practical piece of this is you should get someone who has deep regulatory expertise. Not me, but like there are people who have who are FDA reviewers before, who've lived within the FDA, right? And then maybe they are or they haven't, but they've shepherded many applications through the FDA review process. You could, I would find counsel like that understands what it takes to go from your invention to a FDA cleared device. And that process, they'll explain to you both what it is, but also what do you need along the way, and how do you prepare yourself with all the materials to get there.
Yeah, so I think that's important for the audience to understand that there isn't a separate pathway for AI devices, right? It's the same pathway. It's simply that the FDA has created sort of a way of assessing AI devices, which I would say is actually fairly advanced. I mean, in the world, I don't think there's any other regulatory agency that has thought as much about this. And of course, it's still evolving. So I think the bottom line is, go back to the standard pathways, and then from there, answer the questions. And there are companies that actually consult for these kinds of things. So that makes a lot of sense. There are a couple of questions on generative AI. I think it's inevitable that we're going to get to that. So just as FYI to the participants, the AITC will be hosting a seminar on generative AI, and Wicca will email everyone that information later on in the year. But just based on where you are seeing generative AI going right now, how do you think it could be incorporated into the clinical workflow system, or could it be incorporated? And I think part of the concern there is this trust issue that you have referred to, in the beginning about AI, but now I think even more so with generative AI, since it's unclear for many people where the source of, the data for the insights are coming from, right? So anyway, can you talk a little bit about generative AI and where it's going in the clinic?
Yeah. So I think let's just sort of, as a stepping back a little bit, what is generative AI? It's the types of applications that Gen AI solve are something like you have, I guess let's start with the most common one. Like you have a sequence of words and you want to predict the next word. And an example way in which people use it is within a chatbot, which is you have, you have a large corpus on which this chatbot's been trained. You can enter, a question that you have in mind, and it's producing an answer. And what is mind-blowing is that it's producing an answer by literally modeling it as a word prediction task and a next word prediction task, which is based upon your question, emit a word, then based upon your question and the word it's emitted, emit the next word, and keep doing that until what you get is a coherent answer. That to me is like the coolest and craziest thing, that you can actually write a pretty coherent answer by thinking about only word probabilities and the probability of next word in the context of historical words, because it then also tells me, man, what do humans do and how do humans think? Having said that, this is sort of the most simple, right? Like you could imagine, there's also sort of another way to think about Gen AI as basically these new classes of models that are called transformer-based models that are bigger, that are trained on gobs and gobs of data. They're also more expensive to run. And so another way people think about it is, instead of thinking of it as Gen AI, which is more chatbot, ChatGPT, which is more word focused, more broad use of transformer-based technology to start building richer and bigger models. So one thing that's really interesting is, at least as an AI researcher, here's how I see it. The idea of bigger, richer, deeper models has been like every few years, there's been a shift change, right? Like 2016, when we went into deep learning and started training very large, big neural networks to do things, right? That was basically very similarly at the time, okay, we have these very big models you can train, and now we have, instead of deep nets, transformers, more machinery, more data, ability to scale up training, which is exciting. So one way to think, like in one way, this is just sort of the push towards bigger training from more complex data, bigger data, richer data, right? That's one way. Another way to think about it is the kinds of applications you're tackling. So there are applications where the defined use case is very specific. Like, what are you trying to solve? Like, okay, you're trying to predict, does this person have this problem or not? Does this patient have, will the patient have a complication or not? Or do they have the secondary condition? Like very specific task versus a chatbot type technology, which is a very broad task, right? Like you're just broadly conversing about anything. So I think to me, one big question that is open in the field at the moment, and one like, so I'm on the National Academy of Medicine AI Code of Conduct, and also part of this big national collaboratory that is working with various federal agencies to think through guidance and rubric guidelines. Like how do we evaluate for quality and efficacy? And a big question that's looming at the moment is, we've known how to think about devices independent of whatever technology they use that have a very concrete use case. But how do we think about these technologies that are very broad, right? Like it's unclear what problem they're solving. They're just kind of much more of a technology. And you could almost think of it as, we don't, it's looking for a problem to solve or a million problems to solve. And in that scenario, what does it even mean? So to me, I think the challenge with Gen AI has less to do with the use of transformers, the use of advanced deep big models, and has more to do with the shift towards this kind of technology without one intended use, almost like technology with a million intended uses. And so you could take whatever AI technique, and as soon as you start to solve a problem where the intended use is vague and open, and in a way is a platform technology, which means we want to leave it to the world to figure out what are the million use cases, then I think it starts to hit a lot of like these strange like walls, because when you put it to use within a health system, people are wondering, how can I trust it? Because you've not validated it. And how have you validated it? And regulators will ask, well, how can I trust it? You've not validated it. How have you validated it? So I think that's kind of the challenge. One practical way that I recommend people think about it, and the way we've thought about it as Bayesian, is you can always have a platform technology, but keep finding use cases and validate it on the use case, and ultimately think about the use case, not the platform technology. Because then there's a rubric within which it can all fit. You can have powerful platform technology driving many, many use cases, but then in any given use case, you have a way to, your stakeholders know how to think about absorbing it. Your regulators know how to think about understanding it. And that makes a huge amount of, that makes sense to me, and feels like, even as a scientist, a pretty like solid plan. I'm not sort of saying just believe me. It's that, I'm doing the work to prove it in each case.
So that was fantastic. That answers about 3 or 4 questions having to do with, the ethics, the security, safety, all that stuff, right? So I think what you're saying is, again, less focus on the technology, more focus on the problem and what it's trying to solve. And then making sure that it, in fact, does solve the problem it's trying to solve in a way that is transparent. People understand how it's solving a problem. That's beautiful. I love that. And, I guess from a regulatory standpoint, that also makes regulators more comfortable, right? Because they know then what they're actually regulating.
Correct. Exactly.
Yeah.
Very eloquently put, Phil.
So a couple of sort of, I guess, again, technical questions. This one has to do with patenting. Does it make sense to patent an algorithm? So this just came from someone, and then, they're developing an algorithm. They're trying to figure out, do I bother trying to protect it? Is patenting the right way to do it, etc. I can probably answer the question, but what's your perspective? Because of course you have algorithms. You have a company that's creating value from these algorithms.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting area, and I don't know if I have the most definitive answers, but I can give you my hunch based on practice. I think, like, in a very, very practical standpoint, I think first of all, there's a lot of like pushback on what from an algorithmic standpoint can be patented. Like, historically, there was a period of time where people were patenting algorithms, and then over the last 4 to 5 years, the USPTO has been pushing back on algorithmic based patents. They want you to not patent, they see it as patenting math. And it doesn't make sense to patent math.
Right.
So what they instead want to do is to patent a recipe, a way of doing things, a use. But then I think, to me, those patents are pretty weak. And the extent to which they can be like kind of fought in court in any meaningful fashion is just different from what you could do for a physical molecule. So that's sort of one way to think about it. Another way to think about this is, if you're a company and your goal is to get acquired, then you should think about who your acquirer is and what they care about. And because we're at the intersection of disciplines in biotech and health tech and medicine, there are many biotech companies that have a very patent-first approach because their mindset starts from drugs and devices. And so in that world, they really understand the language of patents and they believe in it. So you having and giving them a war chest of patents could be really valuable if your goal is to build a company from an acquisition standpoint. I think what is really clear is if you have to make a trade-off between spending a huge amount of cycles patenting something versus spending the huge amount of cycles executing, I have a very strong bias on execution. And part of the reason is, this is, at least in the work we're doing, what I'm realizing is it's such a hard execution play that your biggest moat is your ability to execute. It's like your ability to have traction at scale. Like, it's the classic network effects problem, right? Like the more footprint you have, the more you're able to do, the more you're able to do, the more footprint you get. And so in some sense, the patents are kind of not that valuable. They're not that easily defensible in court. And I think the ability to execute is very important. The last thing I'll say is, when I think as a researcher, I was negotiating with Hopkins around like the IP, etc., I actually felt like both sides were new to the game. I was, our counsel was, but also Hopkins. And in some sense, in doing so, we pushed, we sort of used like a molecule hat to approach it. And it's super not clear software follows the same rubric and, even has the same scale up strategy or anything like that. So in retrospect, if I had to do it all over again, I would err on the side of not spending 12 months arguing and instead take a very practical approach to, doing what needs to happen to, speed up execution.
That's fantastic. Yeah, and I would agree with you. Trying to patent, because you can always write around an algorithm, right? To sort of do what it's supposed to do. So I agree. Understand what it's trying to do, and then figure out how to protect that rather than the machinery behind it. So final question, and this is your opportunity to pitch. This is a real question. It's not a setup. So can Dr. Saria explain in more detail what her system, meaning patient health, does as co-pilot, and what was involved in making it do what it does?
Yeah. So I think like it's often easier explained using an example. So let's go back to the example of sepsis, right? So in sepsis, we have lots of treatments that to basically resuscitate a patient. The problem is often we only realize the patient is septic a little too late. So what the platform does is integrates with the EMR, pulls structured, unstructured data in real time, stitches it together, normalizes it, runs real-time AI models, and then moves clinical signals back in place, such as this patient has risk for sepsis and here's why, makes that information available in a way that it's very easy for the care team to understand and act off of it. They see, they evaluate, they act, and then they do take the steps necessary to treat the patient. In this case, provide the relevant treatments, provide the relevant documentation, and close any care gaps that are. And so the platform basically enables this end to end and does it in a way that it's very seamless and integrated with the workflow and, doesn't makes it easy to do the right thing.
So it's a screen in, let's say, Epic, in the Epic workspace. And the way it alerts the provider is it flashes. So I'm trying to sort of imagine, I guess the question is, how does it actually do that? Because we know that there are all kinds of research around, warning fatigue in the ICU, the bells going off, things like that, which makes people ignore these things sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the super cool pieces of work we did last year was we released these 3 papers that came out on the cover of Nature Medicine. It was a study done across 5 sites, academic and community hospitals within the Hopkins network. And what the study showed was started with, 10x higher performance from a detection accuracy standpoint, ability to detect early and in a timely fashion. Then the next part of the study showed 90% provider adoption. So when Bayesian flags a patient, 90% of the time providers go in, look at the data, the result, and enter an evaluation. And then obviously if you have timely and early detection and you have good adoption, then it shows corresponding outcome data like mortality reduction, morbidity reduction. Very significant. It's been one of the largest AI trials to date. It's also multi-site in a way, and almost 750,000 patients, and very holistic in the sense that it doesn't just study retrospective data and performance, but really studies real world adoption, ability to generalize across sites. And so part of the reason I'm pointing to these studies is you're welcome to go look at these studies because they're peer reviewed and published, so you can learn a lot more there. But a huge part of the answer is human factors in design. Like, how do you design things in a way so that it actually, whenever you get something that helps you, you use it. If it's not helpful, you won't use it. That's really like the unfortunate, very simple answer to the problem. And so now, how do you make it helpful and useful? And some of it is changing mental models, right? Like their mental model of an alert is nonsense, noise, alarm fatigue. So how do you go from building trust where you have to show data that you can actually detect? You have to show actual experiences in their own cases where they would have missed that they caught, that would have dramatically improved practice. And then you have to make it so that, even if something is the right thing to do, but if it's hard to do, we tend to not do it. So then how do you make it so that it's easy to do it, right? And that is about configuring the experiences in the EMR, and it's not just sort of the lazy, sometimes there's an element of like, well, here's a way to put the info in, right? You just put it here as a
Right.
a button or like a flashing light and then you're good. But then you're basically kind of pretty much saying, I did this part and I'll leave you to figure out that part. And, the clinician is sitting there saying, I've got a lot of real hard work to do. And the last thing I need is to deal with your nonsense. So, but that alone is like a huge part of the job. Like, how do you educate it and bring them along and implement it in a way that is like easy to adopt?
That's just fantastic. Well, we've run out of time, and I think those are really, really wise words to leave this webinar by. Thank you, Dr. Saria. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Happy Thanksgiving. And please watch out for announcements of other webinars and the one on generative AI that's coming up. Ann Wicker will let you know. Have a great day. Thank you.